This screencast is to support the teaching of a lesson on what is or are or was or were something like. This page of the material comes from Headway Elementary by Liz and John Soares, published by Oxford University Press. And I've also got another activity which comes from Basic Grammar in Use by Raymond Murphy, Cambridge University Press. Let me show you that now. There it is, and I'm suggesting using this because it's going to make the elementary lesson a little bit more difficult, okay, which I think is necessary for a pre-intermediate class. Let's look at how to start the lesson. I think start with some weather vocabulary. We've got some items here where the students have to match a word to a symbol. That seems like a nice start, and add some more complex items, because as I say again, this comes from an elementary book, so let's up the level a little bit by adding some more complex items. Mist perhaps is a bit less known, heavy rain, storm, thunder and lightning. Things like that. You could add a few more items, okay, but it's not the main aim of the lesson, it's just a way in. So I would suggest a test, teach, test approach, which is what the book is aiming to do here. Gives them the symbols, gives them the words, and gets them to try to match them together. And then you might need to do a little bit of extra checking of meaning. If you do have fog and mist, then what's the difference between the two? If you do storm, then you're going to need to get across the strength of that and what's involved. So there might be some meaning checks and some pronunciation as well. And if you're doing pronunciation, I would put it in a short sentence. So it's sunny, it's raining, it's windy, or maybe put it into the past. Well, yesterday it was cloudy. So I think a bit of meaning work and a bit of work on pronunciation would be useful there. And you can do this one here, adding these to it to give them a bit of extra vocabulary to work with. Again, I don't think that's too tricky. You could add freezing and boiling, as they're pretty commonly used in this country to talk about the weather. And then we're going to want to go on to introduce the grammar structure. So what we'd like to do is to elicit the target structures here. So I would suggest, rather than giving them the structures, instead give them the answers. So one in the present, a full answer, one in the past, a full answer, and try to elicit the question. You could always put lines for the number of words, okay, to try to give them some clues. So get them to talk together and say, what's the question for each one? They may well go for what is typically a translation thing, which is how was the weather, how is the weather? And I mean, every now and then we do use questions like that, it's true, but more often than not we use what like, okay, meaning, tell me about it. So I would elicit the question first, okay, and then maybe drill it, all right? And I think it's worth pointing this out because if the students know that like isn't being used as a verb and that it's not about whether we're happy about something, then I think that's important and helps them to understand the structure, because the structure is pretty weird, let's face it. Why are we using the verb like here? Okay. So you can deal with form, what plus something, plus what plus verb be, plus something plus like, yeah, elicit the form from them, and then I think get them asking and answering each other with these two simple questions. What's the weather like today? What was it like yesterday? Or what's the weather like today in Cardiff? Or what was it like yesterday in Swansea? Depends where your students are as well. So a little bit of simple practice asking and answering the questions would be useful to cement the structure. Now the book goes on to do this activity here where there are two of these charts and they ask and answer. I think we can stretch the students to go a little bit further. So if you want to do some work on asking what's the weather like in their country, then you can do, or you can simply move to the next activity, which I'll show you now. So looking at this, we're moving away from the topic of weather, although it is involved in this. And we've got a context of talking about people's countries, which I think is a bit more fruitful than sticking simply to the weather. So you could set the scene, say, right, we're going to make some questions to ask about other countries. And then you can elicit the first couple of questions, 1 and 2, and then let the students work alone to complete the rest of the questions. It's probably useful if they can see the structure in front of them, so they've got it written here, so make sure that's visible on the slide so that they can refer back to it when they're making their questions. Then they should have some completed questions, so at the end check that they've got the right ones, and then maybe drill a few of the questions, see if we can get the rhythm of the sentence right. What's the food like? What's the weather like? What are the people like? What's your city like? Yep, all of these things. And then this of course can move then into a speaking activity. So then you can say, right, okay, these are the questions. Right, I'm thinking of a city that I know really well, okay, and I'm thinking about my country, that a country that I know really well. Ask me the questions and I'll answer. And then get the students to ask you the questions, so you're modelling the task and answer, and then say, right, I want you to talk about your country or a country you know well. But first I'll give you a few minutes to think about your answers. You can make some notes if you want. So how are you going to answer these questions? What's the food like? What's the weather like? Give them a few minutes to answer the questions. You might want to supply a slide with some potential answers because they may not be sure exactly how to answer. So that could be a useful thing to do as well. Give them time to prepare and then set up the task. So you can choose 2 people, one to ask the questions, one to answer, and the others can listen and think of a follow-up question that they would like to ask at the end. While they're speaking, you can be noting errors and examples of good language use, and then you can do some correction work at the end. And I think that should make a nice 40 to 45 minute lesson. If you feel you need something more, you can see that there is the start of the other activity here down the bottom, which is in the past. So you could have that on a slide ready to use if you need it. But I do think that with the speaking activity, that should fill the time.